Welcome to AJS 101, Introduction to Criminal Justice, Lesson 2, Part 3. Let's talk about hate crimes. A hate crime is a crime in which the defendant's conduct was motivated by hatred, bias, or prejudice based upon the actual or the perceived race, color, ethnicity, national origin, religion, or sexual orientation of another individual or group of individuals. And hate crimes are also called bias crimes. Now, federal law requires that data be collected about such offenses because we consider them to be especially insidious and corrosive of our democratic society, and we want to keep close track on them. Now, most hate crimes are motivated by race, and they involve intimidation, although more extreme acts like vandalism, assault, and murder also occur. The reason why race is the most common motive is because race is easily observable. You can't always tell what a person's religion or nationality is, or their sexual orientation. But race is something which is kind of out there in the open. So it's not surprising that race would be the most common motivation. And of course, intimidation is the most common act, harassing phone calls, threats. But again, more extreme acts, vandalism, assault, and murder also occur. Now, some states will enhance or increase the penalties for crimes when they are motivated by hate. Other states claim that a broken nose is a broken nose regardless of the motive, and the person should be treated equally. And there's a big policy debate involved around that. Now, some hate crimes are committed by individuals, while other hate crimes are committed by organized hate groups, like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, or the Aryan Brotherhood. But again, most are by individuals, but you do have, unfortunately, organized groups who do this. All right, let's talk about the National Crime Victimization Survey. We'll switch gears here a little bit. The National Crime Victimization Survey attempts to get a more accurate picture of crime by using victim self-reports of crime victimization instead of the Uniform Crime Report data. Now remember, the Uniform Crime Report, which is the national report compiled by the FBI, is based upon crime reports that are taken by the police and forwarded by the police to the FBI. And those crimes are entered into the Uniform Crime Report based upon their hierarchy rule, which generally means only the most serious crime in each criminal incident. So, the National Crime Victimization Survey doesn't use reports of the police. Instead, it identifies a sample of households from across the nation and questions their members about whether they were the victims of crime in the last year, and if they were, did they report the crimes to the police. So they will send surveyors to the homes of these randomly selected households, talk to the people. Was anybody here a crime victim? What was the crime? They get information about the characteristics of the victim, the characteristics of the offender, some of the details of the crime, and then they ask the most critical question, did you report this crime to the police? Now, let me first talk about why this is accurate. They don't go to every household in the United States. With over 300 million people, there are a lot of households, and you just couldn't go to all of them. So what they do is, they take a scientific sample from the entire population of households. And the sample is a fewer number of households. I'm not sure of the number, it's probably around 10,000. But this sample, the answers from it are very reflective of the whole population because they conduct a random sample where each household has an equal chance of being picked. When you do that, when each household has an equal chance of being selected to be part of the sample, and you have a large sample, statistically, that sample will be almost identical in composition in almost every area to the population. So if you ask the sample questions, you can extrapolate that you would get the same proportion and numbers from the entire population. That's called scientific sampling. And it's used in surveys and polls all over the place, which is why it can be used here. Now, the National Crime Victimization Survey is considered more accurate than the Uniform Crime Report, and the Uniform Crime Report only reports about 1/3 the crimes of the National Crime Victimization Survey. Now, you may say, how do we know that? Well, remember, the Uniform Crime Report consists of crimes that people decided to report to the police, that the police decided to take in a report and forward to the FBI. And then even then, only the most serious crime goes into the Uniform Crime Report. The National Crime Victimization Survey, it picks up crimes not reported to the police because the last question the surveyor asks is, did you report this crime to the police? So if they discover X number of rapes in the survey, and the people also say that only 20% of them reported it to the police, they can assume that the Uniform Crime Report is only capturing 20% of all rapes, which means that if you take the Uniform Crime Report figure and times it by 5, you get a more accurate number of the actual number of rapes. So that is the beauty of the National Crime Victimization Survey and why it's more accurate. Let's talk about fear of crime and reality. Now, crime tops the list of what Americans think are important issues. Crime stories are popular in the news, TV shows, movies, novels. People are very interested in crime, not only because it's fascinating, but because they're concerned about crime. Interestingly, people at the highest risk of victimization fear crime the least, while people at the lowest risk of victimization fear crime the most. So who are people at the highest risk of victimization? Well, they are age-wise, young, gender-wise, male. Young males are at the highest risk of victimization. Those at the lowest risk are the inverse, elderly females. Now, this is not because criminals don't want to victimize elderly females and like to victimize young males. In fact, most criminals would prefer the latter because you get more resistance from a young male. The reason why young males are more prone to be victimized is not because they're young males, but because of the behaviors that young males engage in more than elderly females. Namely, criminal behavior, drug buying, hanging out at night, walking around dangerous areas, going to clubs, using drugs. Young males simply put themselves into situations where they're more likely to be victimized, whereas elderly females are spending far more time at home at night. So it's not because they're young males directly, it's because young males engage in more dangerous or risky behavior. Women in crime. With the exception of the crime of rape, women are victimized less than men. Women fear crime more than men, though, and they make more lifestyle concessions to crime. And by lifestyle concessions, I mean women restrict their lifestyle. They enjoy life less because their fear of victimization. Young males will go out at night, even if they're alone and they have no one to go with. They'll go to a club, they'll go to a bar, they'll go shopping and they'll walk from the dark parking lot into the store. Women think twice about doing that if they don't have someone to go with them because they fear crime. So another victimization of women is their lives are less fulfilling and diverse because of fear of crime, at least some women. Women are now twice as likely to be subjected to violent crime by strangers than by acquaintances. That's right, strangers pose a greater threat than acquaintances to women. And this, of course, is contrary to the impression given in the media, which focuses on domestic violence, date rape, O.J. Simpson. Not to say that being victimized by an acquaintance is not that bad. It's obviously horrible. But number-wise, most women are victimized in terms of violent crime by strangers. However, when women are victimized by acquaintances, it is most often ex-spouses, current boyfriends, and ex-husbands in that order. Obviously, familiarity breeds contempt in terms of this type of usually emotion-linked violence, which can be very extreme. Now, what women are more likely to experience violent victimization? Well, female students statistically have a higher risk. women in the military, unemployed women, single women. They all have higher risks of victimization. Now, this is not because criminals somehow know that women fall into these categories. Remember, what drives these stats are behaviors. Young women, women in the military, young students, they are far more likely to be going out at night, to be meeting new people, dating people they don't know that well. So that's really the reason why. It's their behaviors and not the class of person that they belong to. All right, women as offenders. Now, while the number of crimes committed by women has been increasing, women still commit only about 15% of all violent crimes and only about 20% of all property crimes. However, significant numbers of women do commit certain types of crime more associated with women, such as prostitution. Women also tend to commit more embezzlement crimes and larceny and fraud crimes. But even when women commit violent crimes, they tend to assume secondary roles to men. They tend to be, the getaway driver or the tag-along person, the person who holds the gun. So again, while women have experienced considerable liberation in our country, men still rule in the world of crime, which is unfortunate. Let's talk about drugs and crime. Drug abuse, including alcohol abuse, has direct and indirect costs to our society. The direct costs are to the criminal justice system. Arresting people, trying people, defending people, prosecuting people, putting people on probation, incarcerating people. These are all very costly. There are additional direct costs in rehabilitation systems and in paying for the injuries and deaths that drug abusers cause to themselves and to their victims, drunk drivers, killing and maiming people, along with the property that drug abusers steal and even damage. The indirect costs of drugs are lost productivity. People not showing up for work, people showing up for work and being hung over and not being productive or actually causing accidents at work. So drugs cause a lot of crime, and drugs also cause a great deal of reduced productivity. Not to mention destroying families and having people dying of overdoses. Drugs are quite a bane on our society. Let's talk about the elderly and crime. Now, those over 55 years of age are considered older offenders. Now, remember, we're talking offenders here. In the non-offender population, somebody 55 is not considered elderly. In fact, in today's society, even 65-year-old people aren't really elderly because people are in much better shape today. But if you're a criminal who's been abusing drugs and eating junk food and going in and out of jails all your life, by age 55, your body is pretty messed up. So they tend to be considered older offenders. However, only a small percentage of older people are offenders due to a process called aging out. As people get older, they commit less crime. There's a lot of reasons for this. They tend to have more roots to society. They may have families and kids and jobs that they don't want to lose by being arrested or engaging in dangerous criminal activity. They may mature more, or their bodies are just getting older and tired and they're less capable of doing that. That's called aging out. Now, the number of elderly offenders will be increasing in the next 30 years, and that's due to longer life expectancies. Even though criminals tend to abuse their bodies with drugs and bad food, and there's greater medical science and care today to keep them alive. And another reason why we'll have more criminals in the next 30 years is the aging of the baby boomers. The baby boomers are a demographic group of people who were born between 1945 and about 1960. A disproportionately large number of kids were born during those years because of World War II. World War II was the Great War that was predominantly fought in the 1940s, and a large number of young males were not in the U.S. They were overseas in the Army, Navy, Aircraft, Marine, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, fighting against the Japanese and the Germans. And as a result, they were not in this country marrying and having kids. So when the war ended in the late 1940s, they suddenly all came home. And they quickly played catch up and got married and had families. And suddenly, you had all these extra people all at once having kids. And you had this big bubble of kids called the baby boomers. And that is a demographic bubble which initially caused great expenses because we had to build a lot more nursery schools and elementary schools and high schools. And then they hit the job market and there were more baby boomers with jobs and there was more productivity because of that. Now they're beginning to retire and they're putting a great strain on the Social Security system. So, and of course, because there are more baby boomers, there are going to be more elderly prisoners. Now, when they're incarcerated, elderly offenders pose special problems to correctional personnel. Elderly prisoners are first more likely to be victimized by other criminals in the prisons, so they need more protection. But they're also in usually poor physical shape. They can't get around as easily. They might have to take medications. They might be on dialysis. They might not even be mobile. So they're very expensive to care for in prison. Let's talk about the elderly as crime victims. Elderly people are the least likely to be victimized by crime. And remember, that's because their lifestyle, they don't do dangerous things. They don't go to dangerous places as much as other people. But when an elderly person is victimized by a violent criminal, they are more likely to be hurt. And that's because when you get old, you get injured more easily. You bruise more easily. Your bones are brittle. They break more easily. A fall which you could easily get up from and walk away when you're 20 can break your hip when you're 70. So when they're victimized, it tends to be more serious, the elderly I'm talking about. All right, and finally, let's talk about organized crime. Now, organized crime is the unlawful activities of the members of a highly organized disciplined association engaged in supplying illegal goods and services, including, but not limited to, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, narcotics, labor racketeering, and other unlawful activities conducted by members of these organizations. So these are groups of people and they deal in illegal goods and services in an organized manner. By organized, I mean they have bosses, they have membership, they have rules and procedures, they have territories. This is not, a small group of people who get together and say, let's rob a bank. These are highly organized organizations. Now, what do? Again, they supply illegal goods, stolen property, drugs, illegal services, prostitution, illegal gambling. They do loan sharking. Loan sharking is loaning money at a very high interest rate, a rate so high it's against the law. Generally, people who can't, because of poor credit, can't get a regular loan at a bank, might have to go to a loan shark to get that money and pay much more interest. Because the loan shark also doesn't just ding your credit rating when you don't pay. The loan shark might break your legs. Also, people who need money for illegal purposes will often go to a loan shark. If you need $10,000 to buy a kilo of cocaine, which you intend to resell very quickly for a profit, you can't go to a bank and request a cocaine loan. So you go to a loan shark. Labor racketeering. Labor racketeering is when organized crime members infiltrate a labor union, they get their members elected to offices, or they intimidate the non-organized crime officers and get them to embezzle money and give it to organized crime, to invest in organized crime sham investments that result in the money being lost to the labor union. They drain pension funds. That's called labor racketeering. So organized crime groups do all of these things. Now, who do you think the first organized crime groups in the United States were during the colonial era? Remember, these have to be organized groups, rules, hierarchies, what have you, that engage in illegal activities. So can you think of who the first U.S. organized crime group was? I'll give you a hint. Few students can guess this. I'll give you a hint. If you ever went to Disneyland or Disney World, they actually have a ride that's dedicated to this group. Right? You may have gotten it. If not, the group are the pirates. The pirates were organized thieves. Right? They joined and became crew members. They had different ranks: captain, first mate, bursar, seaman, that got different wage scales. They obeyed the captain, and they went out and they robbed other ships. So that's organized crime. In fact, the pirates were so organized that they actually developed the first known workers' compensation system in this country. Records discovered from old pirate ships or stores or libraries discovered that some of the pirate ships would award cash bonuses if pirates suffered certain loss of body function. So if during a pirate raid you lost an arm, you might get X number of dollars. If you lost sight in one eye, you might get X number of dollars to compensate you. This is workers' compensation, which shows just how organized the pirates actually were. Later, organized crime organizations grew up among immigrants in the developing cities, and they were often allied with corrupt politicians. Immigrants came to this country from overseas, and immigrants have always settled in large cities, especially cities like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Boston. And immigrants tend to congregate or live in the same communities. They want to live together because they feel more comfortable with people who speak their language. They like the restaurants that serve their food, the stores that sell the kind of clothing they like. So the first generation of immigrants, they tend to create ethnic communities in neighborhoods. And each ethnic group has a certain number of criminals, and some of them organize, and they predominantly victimize the members of that ethnic group. And by the way, it's fairly hard for the police to police this because the ethnic group members know that the cops aren't part of their group. They might not speak the language. They don't look ethnically like them. So it's hard to get undercover cops in. And the immigrants are also sometimes fearful of calling the police because they may have come from countries where the police were corrupt and violent, so they don't trust the police. So organized crime in immigrant communities has always been a major problem. Fortunately, as the immigrants stay and their kids stay, and some of them leave for the suburbs and some have more kids, eventually they become very Americanized, and that ethnic group dissolves. And there's very often, that neighborhood is often replaced with a new ethnic group of new people coming into this country. In fact, I grew up in Queens, New York City. Most of the city had ethnic communities from Europe, Italian, Polish communities, Irish, Portuguese. And there were also black neighborhoods and Jewish sections and German sections. But most of those groups, they're 3-4 generations into the U.S. and their kids, they're college educated, they're living in the suburbs, they're here in Arizona. And those very same neighborhoods that used to have the Italians and the Germans and the Greeks now have the new waves of immigrants, people from Ghana, Pakistan, all different parts of the world. But again, they're going to have ethnic groups, organized crime ethnic groups, victimizing them. Still later on, organized crime groups began to form around pure ethnic affiliation, with the Italians predominating. The Italian organized crime group called the Mafia, or La Cosa Nostra, was the predominant, unbelievably powerful organized crime group in this country from the late 1800s up until maybe the 1960s, 1970s. There were other ethnic organized crime groups, but they all recognized the Mafia as the big group, and they didn't mess with the Mafia. And they very often had to get permission for the Mafia to do certain activities. And the Mafia sometimes took a cut of their activities. Well, no more. Today, organized crime is still ethnic, but all groups are now taking part in their own separate ethnic organized crime organizations, and the Mafia no longer predominates. So basically, at least in the area of organized crime, the United States has true multicultural diversity. Sad to say. Okay, so that ends Lesson 2. So at this point, what you want to do is you want to take all of your Lesson 2 notes and you want to study them. You want to take all of your test questions, right? and review all your test questions. You should have the right answers to all those test questions. And remember, your test for lesson 2 comes from the lesson test questions. So I just picked the lesson test questions from the questions you've been answering as you did the readings and watched this video. So study those questions, take the lesson 2 test, get a good grade, and then move on to lesson 3.